Desmond Cole is an activist, radio host. He is the author of the award-winning book, The Skin We're In, A Year of Black Resistance and Power.
Erica.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Jane Gobia, and I serve as Sheridan's Vice President, Inclusive Community. It is my pleasure, along with the Sheridan Student Union, to welcome you to our conversation with Desmond Cole today. I'd like to begin the conversation with an acknowledgement of the land. As we gather virtually, we'd like to acknowledge that all of Sheridan campuses reside on the land that has been and still is the traditional territory of several indigenous nations, including the Anishinaabe and the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, the Wendat, the Métis, and the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation. We acknowledge that since time immemorial, numerous indigenous nations and indigenous people have lived and passed through this territory. We acknowledge these territories covered by the Dish with One Spoon and the Two-Row Wampum Treaty, which emphasize the importance of joint stewardship, peace, and respectful relationships. Let's just focus for 1 minute on what the Dish with One Spoon and the Two-Row Wampum Treaty emphasize: the importance of joint stewardship, peace, and respectful relationships for all of us who share this land. As you may be joining us from different territories, we acknowledge nations and territories you are joining from. Sheridan affirms that it is our collective responsibility to honor and respect those who have gone before us, those who are here, and those who are yet to come. We are grateful indeed for the opportunity to be learning, working, living, and thriving on this land. And this is about the land that we share. Now let us turn our attention to the Black History Month. Black History Month is an opportunity to reflect on Black excellence, past and present. Each year, the Black History Celebration calls on us to educate ourselves on how Black artists, Black public servants, Black humanitarians, writers, scientists, Black entrepreneurs, educators, and many more have contributed and changed the world for the better. Learning about Black history and understanding the roots of our community's fight for social justice is an important part of the work we need to move forward. When we observe Black History Month in February, or every February, Black stories and Black culture ought to be celebrated year-round. As an educational institution, Sheridan strives to create a safe, inclusive space for all our community members to learn, grow, and thrive. We all have a responsibility to educate ourselves about these issues, check our own biases, engage in self-reflection, and consider the actions that we can take to be a positive force for change within our spheres of influence. It is also a time to recommit to a deeper understanding of the unique lived experiences of the Black community. I invite each one to reflect and ask yourself, how am I challenging and confronting racism within my sphere of influence? How can I do better? Is it by learning or is it by unlearning something? Over the past year, Sheridan has taken a number of steps down this road. We have hosted several roundtables and a listening tour to allow our students, staff, and alumni to share their lived experiences and concerns. We have held a series of webinars to raise awareness about the specific impacts of COVID-19 on marginalized members of our community. We have developed unconscious bias, human rights, anti-racism, and anti-oppression training for all Sheridan employees. And we have launched a new bursary block for Black students in financial need. As well, we've hired new BIPOC faculty members in programs that needed a boost under the special program. Well, much of this work was done with the advice of the Sheridan Black Students Association, whose leadership and advocacy has deeply inspired me this past year. Their passion continues to fuel our efforts and keep us accountable. We are truly grateful to our Black students. It is now my pleasure to introduce our very special guest for today's event. Desmond Cole is an activist, radio host, award-winning journalist. His work has been covered by the Toronto Star, Toronto Live, Vice, Now Magazine, BuzzFeed, and many others. I'm sure you've read them multiple times. He documents social justice, or is it injustice, Cole? In Toronto, writing extensively about the Black experience in the city and the Black Lives Matter movement. I guess this is somehow informed by Desmond's own lived experiences. He's going to tell us shortly. Desmond has also addressed housing, social support, integration, civic engagement, and justice for youth. He is the author of the award-winning book, The Skin We're In, A Year of Black Resistance and Power. I encourage you to read that book. It's quite inspiring. Desmond is an extraordinary social justice leader, and I'm thrilled to virtually welcome him to Sheridan. Desmond, on behalf of the Sheridan people, please accept our very warm welcome on this fairly cold day. Take it up from there, Desmond, and welcome.
Hello, Jane. Thank you so much for the introduction. I really appreciate it. And thank you through you to everyone at Sheridan College who has organized this event and made it possible for me to be here today. I greatly appreciate you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. So I couldn't help when I was getting ready to do this this afternoon. I'm a news reader. I read the news every day. I can't help some in this work that I do of always trying to bring in something that is current and that is relevant to something that's really like going on right now. And people who are with Sheridan putting together this event saw me laughing on camera before we started and probably wondering like what I was laughing about. And I said, I'm going to share when I come on to the event. So I wasn't planning to start with this today, but it just came to my attention and I desperately need to talk about this. I am a journalist living and working in Toronto these days, and I was born in Red Deer, Alberta, but I actually grew up in Oshawa in the Durham region. So shout out to those of you who are from Oshawa, who know or have spent some time in Oshawa. You know, I grew up there in Durham region, and I went to elementary and high school in that area. And somebody shared something with me this morning, which is from the government, the regional government in Durham region. It seems like for the purposes of some kind of, you know, Black History Month, inclusion, equity, diversity kind of initiative, the government, the municipal government of the Durham region, created this activity for employees to do for Black History Month. And they kind of created it after like a scavenger hunt style kind of activity. So you guys know what a scavenger hunt is, right? When you are given a list of tasks and you kind of have to check them all off. You might have to find things. You might have to talk to somebody. The region of Durham created this kind of an activity for its employees for Black History Month. If any of you are on Twitter and would like to see this, I just tweeted it out. I would like to read you some of the things that somebody at Durham Region thought were a good idea for a Black History Month activity for their employees. Remember, this is a regional government employer. They have some different suggestions here about things they want people to do. Some of them are like totally normal. Read a poem by a Black Canadian author. Really like that suggestion. Then it starts getting really weird. Spend a few minutes learning about Africa. And they have examples. What is the highest point in the continent of Africa? I'm not sure what the highest point in the continent of Africa has to do with Black History Month, but it's here. But let's move on. What is the name of the largest lake in Africa? What is the name of the longest river in Africa? You know, Africa is a big place with many lakes and rivers and the mountains. So I find this a strange thing. Again, I'm not sure what it has to do with Black History Month, but this is what the government is doing. But it gets more in. Have other recommendations for their scavenger hunt here, including, and I'm not making this up, I put it on Twitter if you don't believe me. One of them here says, dance to a reggae song. Another one says, cook an African or Caribbean meal. And probably the most outlandish one, have a conversation with a Black employee. I want you to imagine this. I want you to imagine that you're one of the poor, like 2 or 3 people, Black people in an office at the regional municipality of Durham. And somebody puts this out and there's like a line forming behind you of people like standing at your desk to talk to you because they need to check off this Black History Month scavenger hunt event. Like it's appalling. It's appalling that somebody thinks that it's okay to do this. And it's appalling that nobody who saw it before it was put out thought like, this is ridiculous and insulting. We can't do this. It has nothing to do with Black history. And it's deeply offensive and uncomfortable for our Black employees. No one thought of that. And so now this is something that, you know, employees who work there have to deal with. And I'm sorry, but I could not resist starting with this today because this is an example of what happens in our institutions when we just think that words like equity, diversity, inclusion, and terms like Black History Month are just whatever makes the white majority population feel comfortable. You know, this stuff is embarrassing. Something like have a conversation with a Black employee like also suggests that people aren't doing that and that it would be a cool thing to go slumming during Black History Month. A Black person you work with, you know, take a departure from your usual. These things are hilarious, but they are also a window into what's happening in Canadian institutions and government institutions in the 21st century. Like, this is not really that surprising to me. It's hilarious and it's sad and it's insulting and it's a lot of different things, but it is not a surprise. And what I would say to begin today is, if anything, let us commit to not being surprised by the constant climate of anti-Blackness and white supremacy that is always around us. Now, white supremacy is a term that I try to use frequently, not because I think it's provocative, but because I think it's accurate. And so some of you might hear what I'm saying and you might think, well, okay, it's a mistake to put these offensive things into a Black History Month activity for employees. It's thoughtless. It's definitely insulting, but how does it have anything to do with white supremacy, Desmond? Are you going too far? And all I would say to you is, what dominant ideas are being expressed when a government employer in 2021 in the Durham region, right? This is the GTA. This is where most of the Black people in the Greater Toronto area, this is where most of the Black people in the country live. How is it possible that something like this could happen and that we would conceive of it as just an accident or the actions of one stupid person? I mean, people are doing these kinds of things in our workplaces and in our work environments and in our school environments all of the time. And they're treating Black history as if there's this fascination about this like distant and strange Black and African and Caribbean culture. And really what we should be talking about in Black History Month, if anything, is the ongoing liberation struggle of African people. Because not far removed from activities like this one that I'm telling you about is, you know, the activities that we do for Black History Month, where we say, Black History Month is about how Black people contributed to the Canadian colonial project. So we did a land acknowledgement at the beginning of this event, and most schools now take time, right, to do a land acknowledgement before all of their events. What does it mean to do a land acknowledgement, though? It means that this is a stolen territory that you're using and occupying and living on, that is the traditional territory of Indigenous people who have the sovereignty over and the decision-making ability and the autonomy in the places where their ancestors have lived for thousands of years. So often what we do for, like, you know, Oppressed People's History Month or Oppressed People's Day or Week is that we talk about how they made Canada a better place. They became the first Black doctor, the first Black engineer, the first Black politician. And I'm not saying that those things are not notable or important, but when they are the extent of what we think of as being Black history, but we do not want to talk about the reality for Black people that are here and living right now, I do have a problem with that. So I like to think of this as African Liberation Month rather than Black History Month. We are still here. We are not simply a historical reality. Our existence and our struggle in this country is not a historical fact. It's something that is playing out every single day. And really with that, I would like to say shout out to any and all Black folks who are watching this, who are students at Sheridan College, who are faculty and staff and support staff at Sheridan College, who are perhaps even administrators. Greetings and hello to all of you. And I say these things that I'm saying, hopefully in service of all of us as Black people, that speaking these truths is what allows us to move forward. I work in journalism in this country, but I do so in a way that is maybe not recognizable to a lot of people. I have never had a full-time job, a regular job in Canadian mainstream media. And yet I've created a lot of work that has won awards and that has been widely read and shared and watched. And yet, I've just written a book which has become a bestseller in Canada, but there's really nobody in the Canadian media landscape who would ever offer me a permanent position, not in the mainstream media. And I've kind of gotten to the point where I would probably never accept that offer, even if it was ever made to me, which it's not going to be. For me, the ability to be independent as a journalist is incredibly important because it allows me to critique what's wrong with our industry of journalism without being afraid that I'm going to lose my job. In an ideal world, a newsroom would be a place where people would actually debate and discuss things with one another, and they would have discussions and they would challenge one another. A newsroom is a dictatorship. That's been my experience, and that's the experience of most people that I know who work in Canadian media. It is not a place to sit around and have debate and share ideas. It's a business, it's a corporation, it's a corporate environment. And because of that, if you're too critical about what your own corporate bosses are doing, they won't give you a job. So I have made decisions that I'm going to want and publish and write and produce the things that I want, even if it doesn't make the mainstream happy. And that's the reason I find myself in the predicament that I'm in. But it's also allowed me to do a lot of work that I really love and that I really care about. And I know that there are journalism students at Sheridan, and I was thinking about the journalism practices that we are taught in schools today. I never went to journalism school. I'm actually a university dropout, but I, got into media by doing, by writing for smaller online publications at the beginning, and then gradually getting bigger opportunities. Now, most of those opportunities haven't lasted very long for the reasons I've just elaborated on, but, being critical of my own profession and wanting to challenge the way that people are being taught how to do journalism today is something that's like really, really important for me. And again, I love bringing people the news, so I want to talk about something that's going on right now that I've found very interesting and which poses an interesting problem for those of you who are in journalism, but really in general for anybody who may one day find themselves in a corporate or institutional environment. So we think as journalists is being kind of like, we're apart from the things that we report. That's what we pretend, if I can say it like that we have so-called objectivity. Now, this is not true. And I could do a whole talk about how objectivity is a myth. But I want to use an example of something that has just happened to help us think about it. In Barrie, Ontario, a few days ago, there was a person who was skateboarding, and according to the information that I have seen, that we've read about, Joe was skateboarding when they were stopped by the police in Barrie, Ontario. And because they got into an argument with the police officer decided to restrain that individual by taking him down to the ground. Now, one of the people who was nearby who witnessed this happening was actually a CCTV camera person. That camera person actually jumped into the altercation and helped the police officer pin down this person who was skateboarding. The officer then proceeded to take this young man and slam his head against the pavement. And there is video of this. It is graphic and it's awful. And I don't ever say that we have to watch these videos in order to understand or appreciate police brutality. But because it was captured on video, a lot of people were talking about it online. But we've just recently learned that the person who jumped in to help a police officer was actually a CBC employee who also actually happens to be part-time an auxiliary police officer. People are talking a lot about this story and about what it means that somebody who's supposed to be employed by the media would be helping a police officer make an arrest. And if that is not like a huge problem, conflict, that it's outlandish. And I look at that and I want to tell you guys, it doesn't actually surprise me that much on an individual level. And I'll tell you why. We as journalists capture things all the time, like this incident of a police officer harming somebody. We get videos like this sent to us all the time. When we receive these things as journalists, we have a choice to make. We can choose, for example, to investigate what we're seeing, to try to get the identities of the police officers who are involved, to try and get their badge numbers, to try and find out anything about their disciplinary records as police and if they've ever harmed anyone like this before and if they were punished for it. But we don't do those kinds of things in mainstream media. So most of us won't actually jump in to help a police officer make an arrest, but we will stand back and watch and document those things and then not ask real questions afterwards to hold the police accountable. And I think that if we look at our industry, like, this is not a surprise. If you watch TV or if you listen to the radio, how often do you see somebody there who is a former police officer who is like doing the news or is giving commentary on a police event? This happens all the time. How many times do you watch the news and hear a story And the only source cited in the story is the police, as if the police's word is law and that everything that they say can be trusted. That's how the media treats policing. The media rely on the police as the official source of information. And so media doesn't want to challenge police, even though this attack on this young man who's skateboarding is like, this is happening in our communities all the time, every single day. And it's not treated that way by our mainstream media. It's treated like an isolated incident, and then the name of the officer, their record of history, what their superiors might be saying or doing, none of these things ever get reported on. So you don't have to actually be an auxiliary police officer moonlighting with the cops while being a reporter to be a news person who is helping the police. Unfortunately, a lot of us, the way we do our jobs every day, are helping the police, and we're doing so without thinking about it because we think that obeying police authority is what everyone does, no matter what their job is. I would like to extend this same analysis, though, to a place like Sheridan College, to an educational institution, because Sheridan College operates in mainly Peel region, which has been one of the most violent places in the country for police in the last few years. And far from distancing themselves from our police or being skeptical of our police, our educational institutions in this province of Ontario are collaborating with the police every day. They are actually the ones providing training for police officers in many of our institutions. And not only that, they are facilitating an environment where on our campuses, police and security forces dominate, make people afraid, surveil and profile people, particularly Black and Indigenous people and other people of color. And I find this particularly galling and interesting because when George Floyd was murdered last summer, when his last moments in this world were caught on video, suddenly all of our educational institutions had something to say about racism, about policing, or even if they didn't use the word policing, they were suggesting that they were appalled by this police behavior. But we have campus police. We have campus security doing the exact same thing. And we operate in cities like Peel Region, where just last year, the Peel Regional Police took the lives of Black people. Jamal Francique, a 28-year-old man shot in the head by Peel Police last year. DeAndre Campbell, a 26-year-old man living with schizophrenia who called 911 for help in his own home because he wasn't feeling well, and 2 Peel police officers showed up to his house, tased him, and one of them shot him to death inside his own home. Ijaz Chowdhury, a 62-year-old South Asian man, murdered inside his apartment by the same Peel Regional Police. You know, this is just last year that I'm talking about. And these are not all of the instances of extreme violence and harm that that we've seen from the Peel Police. But in the communities where schools are operating, where these things are happening, what do we see? We see people saying, oh, that's horrible and it's wrong when it happens to George Floyd, but we don't hear our academic institutions, our colleges and our universities saying anything about Jamal Francique, Ijaz Chowdhury, DeAndre Campbell, Regis Korchinski-Paquette, you know, and I think that there is a huge disconnect here. And I don't believe that a school setting that operates in Peel can pretend that that is not its problem while pretending to be deeply concerned about a Black man being murdered by the police in another country. This is what we have to reckon with. talking about Black history as some safe, neutral thing that we can all get on board with and celebrate is very different from talking about the need for Black people to be free and to be safe, to have somebody to call when they're in crisis who is not going to take their lives. These are much harder conversations, but they're the ones that matter during a time like this. Dancing to a reggae song might make non-Black people feel good about contributing somehow to Black History Month, but it has nothing to do with my liberation, because I can't go out and dance in the street without the cops. We can't be having a good time on a university or college campus without a security officer coming up to us as Black people and asking if we really even go to the school before taking out their notepad. This is the reality that Black students and Black faculty, by the way, are experiencing all the time. I'm hearing this everywhere I speak across the province of Ontario and across this country. So, I want to say that if our institutions want to say they recognize the need to talk about Blackness, that it not be in many of these superficial ways that we are seeing, that it has to be substantive, it has to be led by those who are experiencing anti-Blackness, and it has to be transformative. Making an equity, diversity, and inclusion committee at your college is not going to stop Black people from being profiled by campus security and police. Getting rid of campus security and police is going to do that, and reinvesting the money, by the way, back into your Black and Indigenous students. That's what's actually going to make a difference for us. But making a committee that has no power to influence what happens day to day at the school and putting a few Black and brown faces on it, that is not the change that we're looking for. So I want to stop there, pause there, and give us a chance to now broaden out the conversation. I'm looking forward to being in conversation with Sanjay, who is a journalism student here at Sheridan. And I just want to say in closing for right now that one of the most difficult things about the last 7 or 8 months since George Floyd was murdered, and seeing this global response where everyone suddenly felt like they had to say something about Black life, mostly to satisfy their own conscience, to be honest, rather than to help or support us or amplify us as Black people. Seeing that has been extremely difficult for me, and I want everybody who's listening to this conversation who is not Black to reflect on the toll that this is taking on people in your communities who are being asked what they think of the latest video of a Black person being harmed, or who are asked to explain something when things like George Floyd are on TV, or who are being the subject of a Black History Month event and like, go talk to your Black employee or your Black friend about something so that we can check off our diversity check for this month. I want you to think about what that does to somebody in an educational environment, to somebody who's studying, and how you might be engaging in those kinds of harmful behavior and how you can stop. Because we are not a spectacle. That's been the hardest thing for me, is seeing how a man, George Floyd, a human being with a spirit, with a life, how his last moments of torture and suffering are being portrayed as if they are some wonderful learning opportunity for other people. That man deserved to still be alive today and to be doing whatever made him feel safe and happy and pursuing whatever he wanted in the world. And he doesn't have the opportunity to do that. His family members and friends and community don't have the opportunity to see him ever again. That's not a learning experience for other people. It's a crime. And we have to treat these attacks on Black life as what they are: criminal, not in the legal sense, but in the moral sense. that these are crimes against humanity, against human beings, and they are not an opportunity for a branding exercise by a college. They're not an opportunity to show how much you're committed to equity, diversity, inclusion. What does diversity have to do with the police murdering someone? What do those things have to do with one another? We need to start using language accurately. And for those of you who are saying, well, but I'm still learning all these things, that's fine. That's fine. Take the time to read and listen and learn, but do not engage in performative allyship just because you think that it's the fad, which is what we've really seen since George Floyd, and which we must be challenging. So I'm going to leave it there. I want to turn it over to Sanjay. Thank you to Sheridan College. Thank you to Jane for the introduction. Looking forward to the rest of the conversation.
Wow. Wow. Thank you, Desmond, for your insightful words and for sharing your perspectives with us. Quite a lot of food for thought right there. I would now like to introduce our first-year journalism student, Sanjay Gray, who will lead our discussion with Desmond. Sanjay was born in Jamaica and also lived in the United States before immigrating to Canada. He hopes to build a career writing about football, travel, and politics. It is now my pleasure to turn the camera back to Sanjay for the next part. Thank you so much. Welcome, Sanjay.
Thank you, Dr. Jane. Thanks so much to Desmond for that informative and important presentation. Before we get started, just a reminder to the audience to enter your questions for our guest speaker in the chat box, and we'll get him to answer as many of them as we can. So the first question I wanted to ask you, Desmond, was about optical versus actual allyship. Where have we seen this in the past few months, and what's the best approach to address it?
Yeah, I mean, this is really what I was trying to address toward the end, Sanjay. And by the way, thank you so much for doing this and for being a part of this event with me.
No, thank you. The thanks goes to you. It's honestly so immense to meet somebody in your position, knowing that you're eventually what I would like to be. You're in a position where I would eventually like to be. So thank you so much for doing this.
Thank you. I mean, you know, the performative stuff is everywhere. And it is like, as I mentioned, it's a branding exercise, right? And so it's being done by corporations, by government institutions, by academic institutions, including our schools. And they're essentially being like, well, I'm with it. Like, I know what's going on with George Floyd, and this is a great opportunity for me to show my cultural literacy. But when it comes to Black students who are afraid of police on my campus, I'm not actually going to do anything. We all know that kind of policing has to continue, right? The kind of policing that hurt George Floyd way, way, way over there is bad. But come on, you can't expect me to stop doing it. Like, we need safety. And what would the people who called the police on George Floyd say, except that they also were seeking safety, but they ended up murdering him? Those who decided that they were going to call the police on George Floyd are complicit in his murder. And so, like, if we're creating, for example, situations on campus where Black students, Indigenous students have to fear the same thing. And what's really important for me here, Sanjay, is that, like, a school like Sheridan can have a really big voice in speaking back to the kind of police brutality that's happening in Peel region right now where the school operates. If a school wants to come out and start speaking about these things and using its platform, it can have a tremendous impact. But then, of course, that school is going to think to itself, well, will the government try to restrict my funding if I do that? Will I get in trouble? Will it be unpopular? Will the media write nasty stories about me? And that's why the performative stuff happens, because it's just easy to play Bob Marley and play Kendrick and then call it a day, right? It's a lot easier and less risky to have to do those things. But engaging in this struggle can't be performative, because what we are asking people to do is risky. And it does require you to stand up and to be challenged and unpopular by those around you. How do you think we feel, though? We're out here doing this every day, and it's part of our lives. So I would just simply repeat for people that your performative stuff is worse. It's adding to the pain and to the harm. And it is actually better not to say anything than to pretend you're a part of the Black struggle when you're not willing to do anything for it.
Thanks. Okay, my next question is, what do you think about the events in this past summer, especially regarding, I know you mentioned her name, Regis Korchinski-Paquette. How did people react? Was this optical allyship or actual allyship?
So for those who still may not be familiar with this story, and you know, it's sad because people can tell you what happened to George Floyd, but you tell people in our own communities the name Regis Korchinski-Paquette, many people still don't know who that is. Regis was a 26-year-old woman who was at home in her apartment in Hyde Park last summer in May. And she and some of her family members were in an argument. And they called the police. The thought of Black people calling the police to help them settle a dispute scares me because I know how the police intervene in our families and in our communities. But that was the decision that they made. And quite frankly, this is what we are all told to do in society from the time that we either immigrate and arrive here or the time that we grow up. We are told to call the police, to call 911, right? And that's what they did. The police came into this apartment, high rise in Hyde Park. They separated Regis Korchinski-Paquette from her other family members and brought her inside the apartment while the family members stayed out in the hallway. Now, there were multiple police officers in the apartment with Regis, you know, while she was in there, separated away from her family. And somehow, while those officers were in there with Regis, her family started to hear her screaming. And Regis Korchinski-Paquette fell off the balcony of her 24th floor apartment and died. The Special Investigations Unit here in Ontario investigated that and decided, as they do in 97% of their investigations, that no officer was going to be charged with anything having to do with Regis that evening. What we saw next was remarkable. I went to a march that took place a few days after that, Sanjay, and there were tens of thousands of people there. It was one of the larger actions that I've actually ever seen in Toronto, and it was a very diverse group of mostly younger people who felt like days after George Floyd had been killed, like maybe it's happening here. We need to come out and be shown and be counted and say something here.
Right.
I don't think that that was performative. And I don't think that the activism that I saw happening all last summer, where people were taking that energy for people like Regis and saying, defund local police forces, take away their guns and their money and reinvest that into mental health supports in our communities, rent and safe housing in our communities, better education in our communities. Stop giving the police everything and pretending that they can solve the problems after they've occurred, and start investing in our communities with that money that we're giving to the police beforehand. Because once we have issues in our community, it's too late. Those things are the real work. And I applaud people who have taken the last 7 or 8 months, particularly younger people and students, this summer and fall and beyond, to listen, to learn, to read. The term defund the police was not part of our lexicon a year ago. It was not. And now people are taking that seriously and learning about why we would say that,
right,
and what it means. And so I'm incredibly encouraged that this is happening. And I have to give a shout out to prison abolitionists, thinkers, academics, activists, people in places high and low in community who have been saying these things like defund the police, release people from prison, there's groups out here that have been saying and doing that work for years. And finally, we're beginning to listen. And they deserve a lot of credit for laying the foundation that these conversations can now happen. And I could name lots of people, but I'm thinking particularly of groups like, the Toronto Prisoners' Rights Project here in Toronto. I'm thinking of prison abolitionists like L. Jones in Halifax. I'm thinking of Robert Maynard, the incredible scholar who wrote Policing Black Lives, Idil Abdullahi, who's been doing work in with our prisoners in this province for so long. Like, people have been supporting this new way of thinking and practicing it in the ways that they can, and hoping that everybody else is going to catch up. And I think gradually we have seen that change this last year.
Okay. I have a question from somebody in the audience here. As an elementary school principal, I'm curious what a 10-year-old Desmond Cole wanted to or should have experienced in elementary school. What is missing in the public elementary school system?
I'm not going to talk about myself personally too. My book was mentioned off of the top. I will say that in writing my book, The Skin We're In, A Year of Black Resistance and Power, my editor did encourage me to share public or personal stories, I should say, about things that I've experienced. And that was like the hardest part of writing the book for me, because I don't like talking about those things. They're painful. And in the same way that I say that we shouldn't have to watch a video of a Black person being hurt in order to always asking Black people to tell us their stories of harm is something we have to think about. Not that I don't appreciate the question. I understand what the question is asking. But I will say this, and this is one really simple thing. Our schools are places where teachers and principals have had and continue to have the ability to suspend and expel students. And across the GTA, can anybody who's watching today guess who's most likely in our elementary and high schools in the province of Ontario? Who is the most likely child to be suspended or expelled in their school, no matter what part of the province they happen to be studying in? Any guesses? And so we want to talk about all kinds of other things. We want to talk about, again, how do we celebrate Black history in our schools? Stop discriminating against your students before you have that other conversation, though. Like, these things are not hard. What's hard is having the courage to actually fight for those things when your elementary school colleagues are saying that, like, that 11-year-old is dangerous. That 11-year-old is violent, or that 10-year-old needs to be taught a lesson. These are harmful ideas for students and children that are kind of pervasive everywhere. And being the person who's like, actually, I don't agree that we treat students like that, that sets you apart and makes you the target of people being like, oh, well, what's your problem? You don't like discipline, you don't like safety, you don't like order. The hard part is not, again, celebrating with us, it's standing up for us. And so when I see children, I wrote in my book to tell a story that was public and not just a story about myself. One of the stories in my book is about a 6-year-old Black student in Mississauga, again, Peel Police, who was handcuffed in her classroom because the teachers in the school called the police on this 6-year-old child. And she and her mother have been fighting for 5 years now, 4.5 years, to have to deal with the trauma of this incident. And to this day, I can't tell you, Sanjay, what's the names of the police officers who would go into a school and handcuff a child, because those names are never released. And those men are probably still working around children and students every day. So what can we do in our schools? We can protect our students, and we can stop making school a place that is another playground for the police. The same way that I'm talking about how campus security and campus police just kind of come in like they own the place, I feel in my interactions with teachers and with parents that there's essentially nothing that a police officer couldn't just walk into a school and demand that the teachers wouldn't listen to. The police listen, the teachers and school administrations in this province listen to the police like they're gods. And we have to learn how to say no to the police rather than being collaborators with them if we want to protect Black children.
Fair enough. I have another question here from our audience. How do you feel your work with TDSB and their partners with Toronto Police Services has impacted students there? What needs to be done with that relationship?
So I'm guessing that this question is about the push around like getting police officers out of our elementary and high schools, which is yet another issue apart from the suspensions and expulsions that I can raise. What needs to happen at the Toronto District School Board? I mean, how much time do we have? Again, I've written a lot in my book about what's going on. I think that the biggest thing for TDSB, but for all of our schools in Ontario, is if we go back to the 90s when I was in elementary school and high school, the Premier of Ontario was a conservative, had a conservative majority government. Sound familiar? And that Premier decided to make a whole bunch of cuts, including some severe cuts to education and to change the way that our schools are being funded. We're still paying for those choices all these years later, because what has happened in Ontario is that, first of all, if you live in a poorer community in a place like Toronto, it's more likely that your school is going to be underfunded, right? And so if your school is underfunded, it doesn't have things like meal programs for students. It doesn't have things to support students after school and to use that school facility as a place of ongoing support and learning, right? And then those same schools turn to the police and they say, well, since we don't have any supports for our kids, I guess we'll just police them. And then we have these toxic relationships where police officers are confronting young people in our schools. That's not just the TDSB. We need to take the money and the resources that are being used in our schools to punish students and reinvest those into the supports that young people need. And we need to stop inviting the police into, I don't think police should be allowed in our schools. I don't believe in police, but as long as they continue to exist, Sanjay, I don't actually think that a police officer should ever be on a school property watching students parked in the parking lot like they're doing, sitting. Any school I can go to, high school across the city of Toronto, especially the schools with Black students, those students will tell you where the cops park their cars to watch kids who are 13 and 14 and 15 years old, to stop them when they're walking home and ask them questions. If the schools are not on the front line of defending students from this kind of tyranny, then I don't know what we're doing. So we fought real hard to get cops out of the Toronto District School Board. They're still in the Catholic Board, by the way. But the relationships between police and our schools persist. And the mentality that students, what they really need is discipline and authority in order to succeed in the world is still the dominant idea in our schools. And that they can do that on no money, right? That the local police force can have all the money in the community, but that everybody else has to kind of scrape and improvise and volunteer their own time and money. Why is a police force in a municipality like the most important thing that we fund? How come food, clothing, clean water, access to like mental health services, why are these things funded in our communities more than the police are? It's about priorities for me, very much about priorities.
Okay. I know you touched on this a little bit in your presentation a little bit earlier, but I wanted to ask again, what are the roles and responsibilities of the EDI offices in organizations, and how do we measure the success of these entities to hold them accountable?
let's talk about this. So EDI is an interesting thing for me because it's pretty new in my experience in a lot of colleges and universities that creating an EDI group and equity, diversity, and inclusion, having people in the faculty kind of, or even students be a part of that group, appointing somebody to be like the lead of diversity or equity in the school. I don't know about you, Sanjay, but I feel like these things that I'm seeing are pretty new. And people might think that, again, they represent a kind of progress. So the first thing I want to say about these groups is that I recognize that Black and Indigenous and other racialized people who are in our schools have fought super, super hard to even get concessions like EDI groups. So I want to acknowledge the work and the tremendous struggle and sacrifice that people have had to make for there to even be these kinds of groups for us to talk about and analyze in the first place. But what I really think about EDI is I'm curious about how much influence it has. And I'm curious how much influence it is expected to have when it is an offshoot of a school administration that has people making decisions and already has a decision-making structure. Nobody puts EDI at the top of their decision-making structure and says all decisions made at a school are now going to come from here and they're all going to be informed by this. No one does that. And it makes me uncomfortable to think like, we're going to create an EDI part of our school, but it's not going to have decision-making ability. It's going to be made of well-intentioned people, many of them Black and Indigenous and other racialized people, and they're going to get to have a say within that committee. But then when it comes to the president of the school, the board of the school, the executives and administrators and decision makers of the school, they're going to be like, thanks for your input. Thanks for your advice. We're going to do what we need to do. That's my great fear around this emergence of EDI, is that it becomes tokenized and that it becomes a place for a mainly white administration culture in Ontario to push off its problems about racism and say, here, you all deal with it as the Black and brown people at the school. I don't think that that's really helpful for us. EDI can be a good thing, but it's like Black History Month. If you're not addressing the real issues, then it just becomes another tokenistic celebration. And so I feel somewhat skeptical, I have to admit, about how much EDI can do, particularly because when you prioritize something, you don't make it an offshoot. Like the fact that we even have to have a Black History Month suggests that the rest of the year we're doing something else. Like that questionnaire. Go talk to one of your Black employees, right? As if you don't do that all the time. It's very much framed as a departure from what we normally do. And anti-racism is not the same as EDI. Fighting against instances of bigotry and racism and discrimination, transphobia, ableism, that's not the same thing as EDI. We have to get away from the celebration model and the celebrating firsts and promoting one or two people for tokenistic purposes model. And what EDI can do, if it's effective, is to say, like, what's the circumstance for like the average Black student in our school? One of the big concerns I hear from Black students a lot, Sanjay, is about money and about the affordability of going to school. So I would hope, for example, that EDI has the ability to challenge its schools about the fact that, hey, Black students are having a really hard time affording their education. What are we doing about that? That's when it can become a force for structural change and not be tokenistic. So that's my hope, and that's what I want people to push for. Can I actually pick one out here that I see? I'm trying to keep an eye on the chat.
Sure, go ahead.
People are helpfully posting some of the stuff here, and this one caught my eye, and I feel I want to address it. So, someone said, "Oh, I've lost it. Give me a second." Yes. What are your thoughts on Black History Month as a whole? I recently saw a clip of Morgan Freeman on 60 Minutes. Sanjay's laughing because he knows this one. And Morgan Freeman was saying he wished that Black History Month didn't exist. He doesn't want his history relegated to 1 month. What are your thoughts on this month? Does it help or does it hinder? I think I have been pretty clear in what I've said so far about what this makes me think about. But I want to say something really particularly about Morgan Freeman. Morgan Freeman has also said that the way to make racism go away is to stop talking about it. And that is a very visible and prominent Black person saying something that is actually deeply, deeply harmful to us as Black people in a whole. Because when you're rich and visible like Morgan Freeman, you can get away maybe with not talking about Blackness, and it won't harm you in the same ways that it's harming other people. That doesn't mean Morgan Freeman doesn't experience racism. I know he's Black, but I'm saying this to say that one of the ways that non-Black people begin to introduce themselves to conversations about Blackness is they find a Black person saying something that they are interested in. And very often that Black person is saying something like, yeah, just stop talking about racism and then it'll go away. And that's really appealing to somebody who doesn't want to do any work and challenge themselves about racism and anti-Blackness. And so what I would say to people is, I mentioned earlier, I always use the term white supremacy. The people who founded this country were white supremacists. Sir John A. Macdonald founded this country talking about the need to serve the Aryan race and the Aryan people. Sir John A. Macdonald created with his colleagues something called the Indian Act, which still exists and is legal segregation in Canada for Indigenous people for over 150 years. Like, the so-called founding fathers of Canada created this with a white supremacist ideology. So when I say that our government institutions and our schools and all of our institutions are operating under a white supremacist framework, this is what I'm talking about. It's not an exaggeration or a provocation. It's literally the ideas that have built this country and all of its institutions. And people need to understand history more than picking out one or two Black people who are saying something interesting, including myself, and being like, that's my take on Blackness. I just listen to this Black person and whatever they say is good. Understand your history. Know the history of this country and the ideas that have justified the poor treatment of Black and Indigenous people. And then you'll really be able to know how to engage in a different way in the world. You don't have to rely on what one or two people say. You can learn about your own country, and you have to.
Okay. So I have another question here. I sort of actually have a little question about your book. I was reading it recently, and you spoke a little bit about how this inherent misogynistic attitude that we grow up with and we're raised with as young men kind of add to the white supremacist construct that we live in, and it lends to our transphobia, homophobia. What are the ways do you think that we as young Black men can overcome these tendencies and habits, these bad habits that we were raised with?
This is a great question. It's a question that is not only for young Black men or Black men of any age. So you and I are two Black people talking to one another. However, I don't make my analysis of this because there's something particular about the Black community that is sexist, homophobic, transphobic. And in fact, white supremacy actually makes us believe that all of those things come from other cultures and not from white supremacy, which is why it's okay to talk about Muslim people in other countries controlling women's bodies. But we have people for the last 10 years in Canada making laws about what Muslim women can wear. And the comparison is not made in the same way, right? So I want to say off the top that patriarchy is acting in concert with white supremacy and other dominant ideologies to hold certain people down. It is not a racial thing. It's about power, frankly. As far as what we can do about it, I would say, again, we desperately need to learn and read and reflect and challenge ourselves. So I was given the opportunity in 2015 to write a book. And that book was meant to be about Black experiences in Canada. I could have chosen in my book to cite only other Black male scholars in this country, because God knows that that's who in the majority gets to have a voice on these subjects. But I intentionally tried in my own research and in my own storytelling to center the stories of Black, queer, and trans people, to center the stories and the advocacy of Black women who are doing incredible work and scholarship in this country. Like, I made that choice after coming up for many years in journalism, not thinking that way, and taking for granted that if I'm being given a microphone and a platform, that I can speak to all these issues of Black life, when I still come at those issues as a cis Black male who was born in a middle-class family, who speaks both official languages, who was born in Canada and never had to immigrate here or go through a citizenship process, right? I am living a different experience than other Black people, and I don't have the authority to represent and to speak for the experiences, for example, of Black women, of Black trans people, but I can amplify. So that's what I tried very hard to do. And that practice of amplification is like one little thing that we can do to be more aware of how often as men we're just unquestioningly given a chance to speak. You know, Robin Maynard in Policing Black Lives has a whole section in her book about instances, publicly documented instances of police brutality against Black women. I am willing to bet you that most people in this country cannot name a single one of those highly publicized, nevertheless, kinds of incidents. And Regis Korchinski-Paquette, I think I said that she was 26 years old when I first mentioned her, and I apologize, she was 28. But Regis broke through the consciousness of Canada in a different way, because for once we were talking about an instance of police brutality against a Black woman. And even though those instances occur all the time, we also see that even in Toronto and in the GTA, policing and the Black community is very much framed as this like young Black men issue. It erases all kinds of other experiences that men cannot speak to. So it's about being more aware of things like that. I really appreciate your question, though.
Sure.
And can I say one other thing too? And again, I think I want to say this, thinking about all of our communities, no matter what our racial background is. I have evolved my thinking and my beliefs to be an abolitionist for institutions like the police, prisons, the child welfare system. I believe that those institutions are doing more harm than they are helping in our communities. And that all the money we spend on them, if we simply invested that into the people that we're policing and jailing and stuff, that we would solve so many of our problems. One of the consequences of my ideology, and something that we all have to grapple with, is that, for example, if you're a man in a society where our violence as men is completely normalized, and you want to do something about violence against women, intimate partner violence, right? And there's no police to call anymore. What do? I want to be very clear. The police do not stop women in our society from being abused. And in fact, surprise, surprise, the police are more likely than members of the general population to engage in domestic partner violence and abuse of women, because they have too much power and no one can hold them accountable when they abuse it. So pretending that the police, like, again, I encourage anybody who's watching here today to just go and Google the experiences of women in GTA policing. Read what women in our police forces here in the Greater Toronto Area, in Waterloo, in Toronto, in Durham, in Peel. Read about the lawsuits, read about the human rights complaints from women working here in our police forces and what they say about the way that they're treated by their male counterparts. Those are not going to be the people who solve issues of domestic violence. But if there's no police to call, that means that when we as men know that our pal is abusing his partner, we're going to be the ones who have to say something and intervene in that situation when there's no more police to do it. And I don't think that we as men have really begun to grapple with that. Those of us who are talking about abolition and who are talking about an end to policing, we are going to have to do the accountability in our own communities for people who are harming women, for people who are engaging in abusive behavior against queer and trans people. If we don't want the police to come into our communities and solve that problem, we actually have to be willing in a non-violent and constructive way to do it ourselves. And not a lot of us want to have that conversation.
That's very true.
We need to start having it. But
that's very true.
Excellent question.
Okay. One more about Sheridan. Okay. Sorry, I think we have a little bit of feedback there. As an educational institution, what programs, initiatives, and engagements does Sheridan College need to invest into both short-term and long-term to make sure we're meeting our goals of learning and unlearning?
So I want to speak again to journalism, which is the program that you're in, and which is the world that I'm familiar with. Then I want to broaden out a little bit beyond that. Most of the journalism students, the Black journalism students that I meet across the province, are Black women. And they are telling me that just like when I write about my experiences at the Toronto Star, which I had to leave that publication because of their racism, that Black journalism students, particularly Black women, are telling me that they're experiencing these same things in the classroom. And that essentially they're being told things like that writing about Blackness from a perspective of wanting Black people's safety, that assuming that Black people's humanity is a given, that's somehow biased, that being pro-Black is not an objective way of engaging in journalism. And what that's doing in my experience is it's discouraging a lot of people from even continuing in their journalism studies. But then if they do continue, it's also telling them, don't be honest about your experience because you'll be punished for it. And I think that our schools need to change that. I think Sheridan needs to change that. It needs to challenge that with its own professors, because there is not a single journalism school that I've been to in this country where I do not hear these kinds of stories. And so it begins in the classroom before students ever get into the working world. And these ideas that, so if I can give an example, you know, in the time of like regular lynchings in the United States, and white people, instead of having the police do it for them as they do today, just taking it upon themselves in mobs to go out and lynch Black people, harass Black people, threaten Black people, because the society condoned that and they had the ability to do it. Black reporters who actually reported on things like lynching and described it in the horrific ways that it was happening were called biased. They were being told by their society that you reporting on this and suggesting that the white people are doing it because they're racist. How do you know that Black person wasn't guilty of something? How do you know that you didn't know what the Black person did before they were lynched? And so people like Ida B. Wells, one of the greatest journalists of her era, was regarded by people like the New York Times as just being like this activist. Now, today, we look back at the scholarship of people who wrote and the journalism of people who documented lynching, and we're grateful. Because what would we do if we didn't have those documentations? But in their own time, they were treated as biased activists who are trying to prove a political point instead of just reporting the news. And I want to use a cautionary tale for all of the people who are instructing Black people today that they're being an activist, because they know that the police are harming our communities, because they know that the child welfare system and the education systems are harming our communities, and they want to write about it. They want to do a report on it for radio or for TV. They're not being biased. They're talking about an experience that maybe makes people uncomfortable, but that is challenging white supremacy and colonialism in this country. And they need to be allowed, as I need to be allowed, to do that work. So you need to be allowed to do that work.
So do you think that people are labeled with that activist sort of label when they cross that line?
I see it all the time. And I have a friend right now who's in Montreal, and her name is Émilie Nicolas. And, she's a journalist and a very brilliant writer. And some of her colleagues in Montreal are making these same accusations against her right now. So, she was very outraged, as many of us were recently, when a professor at the University of Ottawa used the N-word in class. And the reason that this is outrageous is not because one white person does it. It's because the majority of white people defend them when they do it. And again, make excuses that cannot be excused. When Emily started writing about this, her colleagues started saying, this is an activist. When she started saying, like, this is just racist and you can't do it, that was the response of many of her colleagues. And so what does that say to Black women who want to get into journalism, who are experiencing these things in their families and in their daily lives and in the institutions that they're at? What is it telling them? It's discouraging them from actually talking about their experiences. And we shouldn't do that.
One more question about, you mentioned your role at the Toronto Star, and you also had a radio program, but you've left both roles. For someone like me starting out, obviously I would jump at that opportunity, but I know you had your reasons. Could you speak to those reasons as to why you left both those jobs?
Yeah, I will. They were for different circumstances. So again, I shouldn't be leaving camera while I'm doing a live event.
All right.
But I got to grab something that's like right here. This is the book. So the best answer to your question is in these pages. And I encourage people to support my journalism work by buying this book because, like I said, I'm not working full-time in the industry. I'm doing this as an independent journalist who doesn't want to be affiliated with corporate media because of the restrictions and the limitations that are placed on you. I left the Star and News Talk 1010 for different reasons, but I want to talk about each. When I started at the Toronto Star in 2015, I was actually invited to be a regular columnist there. And I want to tell young journalists what that actually means. The Toronto Star put me on the front page of their newspaper the first day that I became a columnist. They made this big deal about me being there. It was very like EDI. It was very like I say, like we're not going to address the structural stuff, but we're going to do this tokenism thing that says, look at this prominent Black person. Look, we're featuring him. We're giving him a voice. When I took that gig, Sanjay, there was no contract. No one signed me to a contract. I started as a freelancer, and they're like, yep, submit your piece every week. I was writing once a week for the Star, and then submit your invoice. I didn't have a salary. I'll tell you, I got $500 a piece for doing that kind of writing. And that is on the higher end of what a freelancer can get anywhere in this country for writing 725 or so words every week. I see people getting offered way less than that all the time. Now, you're writing one piece a week for the Toronto Star, getting your $500, but it takes a lot of work to do that one piece, and it takes away from your opportunities to earn income elsewhere. This is the great challenge of being a freelancer, is that in theory, if you could do, 2 or 3 of those a week, man, you'd be flying, but you can't because of time restrictions and because of all the other things we have to do. You can't do it well, certainly. I had no contract. So if the Toronto Star wanted to have my column for a month and then say, Desmond, we're sick of this, goodbye, I would have no recourse against that. I was not a member of the union. I did not have any benefits. I did not have any vacation time. And again, my face is on the front page of the cover the day that I debut, as if like, look, we're making a big deal about talking about Black issues. As I document in the book, only months after I had begun doing this work, I was summoned by one of the leaders of the publication, the acting publisher, John Honderick. He took me out for lunch. He did not explain to me through my bosses why he wanted to talk to me. It was just like this mysterious thing. And why does he care to talk to somebody as low on the food chain in the organization as me? Like, I'm not even a full-time employee. Why does he even want to talk to me? I'm not a part-time employee. I'm an occasional employee. And the head of publishing now wants to sit down and have dinner with me. And I'm like, is he going to offer me something? But in my mind, I was like, no, he's not going to offer me something. He's going to tell me something. And what John Honderick told me was that I was writing about race too often. You recruited me knowing what I write about. You put me on the front cover the day that I debut. By the way, I might have written about race 3 times in all of that span in the 8 months between when I started and when he called me into his office. I went back and checked because I felt like it was like a maddening experience to be told you're writing about race all the time. And I'm like, but hang on a second. Like, I wrote about the Canadian election. I wrote about child welfare rates. I wrote about a homeless shelter being targeted by the community who didn't want it in their community. I wrote about all kinds of things. Sometimes I wrote about race, but what's the problem about writing about race? If I'm doing it better than anybody else, and if I'm bringing an audience to your newspaper, why don't you want that when you hired me, knowing what I write about, right? So it was deeply confusing and troubling. And right after I had that conversation, my column was cut in half. So then I was writing every other week. And it wasn't long after that before I realized I have no future at this organization. I'm writing a really popular column. I'm marketing the crap out of it every week on social media and getting more views myself for my work than the Toronto Star by promoting me. And I'm giving them to that for free because their $500 a piece does not include all this extra marketing work that I'm doing. And yet I was chopped. And, we're seeing a lot of layoffs. People might have been seeing the layoffs that have been happening in radio in the recent days. Bell Canada has cut a lot of people in radio recently. This is the era that we're living in. And I just decided after a while that, there's a specific incident that pushed me over the brink, and I won't tell about that because people want to read the book. But it was very well documented. It was very public. And I just decided I'd had enough of the Toronto Star and I wanted to leave. News Talk 10, where I was on the radio for 5 years, is a bit different. I had my disagreements with the management at News Talk 1010 as well. However, I was able to stay there for 5 years doing a weekly radio show because for the most part, they left me alone and they let me say the things that I wanted to say. I got to say them on a Sunday afternoon for 1 hour a week, and I was paid a fraction for each one of those radio shows of the $500 that I got for each Toronto Star piece. I don't even want to tell you how much because it's embarrassing. But this is the freelance world. And I did that because me getting out my messages and doing the stories that I wanted to do was more important to me, Sanjay, than the money. But we can't live like that. You can't raise a family like that. You can't pay rent like that. I had other things going for me that were able to make this possible. And you know, I have lived in poverty for the vast majority of my journalism career. And I mean in poverty. This is not a choice that I want other people to make so that they can pursue the things that they care about. The industry has to change and we have to change our expectations within it. But I will say too, and I'll end here on this point, we are operating in a corporate media environment. So when I worked at the radio station, that radio station was owned by the same Bell Canada that's now been cutting a lot of jobs. And people are like, it's so cruel for Bell Canada to cut jobs during a pandemic. And how hypocritical of Bell Canada to do Bell Let's Talk and then to cut all these jobs during a pandemic. Guys, they're a corporation. They're a corporation. Their duty is to their shareholders. Their duty is not to provide decent work for people. And when you're at Bell Canada, they don't give you benefits. They don't give you mental health supports. They don't give you sick days. They don't pay you properly. So we're engaging in a anti-capitalist struggle when we engage in a workplace struggle, whether we realize it or not. Because asking corporations to treat us nicely when that's not what they do, there's a disconnect. And I want everybody who's in media and journalism and anybody who's studying in general to really think about the world of work that you're headed into. It is not a world of work that values you as a human being. Your value is as a laborer and for the work that you can produce for these industries. That's their first kind of perception of you as a person. And so our anti-capitalist struggle is to literally live in a world where we are not judged and valued for how much labor we produce for a corporation and its rich shareholders. That's the problem. And it's a problem when organizations like CBC, which is government funded and is not supposed to have that same mission, behave in the exact same way that all these other corporations do. Because CBC is no better than any of them, and it treats Black employees the exact same ways that I'm talking about that the corporate world does. So it's a problem across the board.
Okay. Thank you so much. Once again, I'm going to wrap up my part of this. Thank you so much again for coming in. I'd like to thank you for taking the time to speak with us, as well as Dr. Jane Ngobia, Danny, Shamel, and the entire Sheridan community for the participation and hard work to bring this event to you at your home. And now I want to invite you to just leave us with some food for thought before we close out. So, Desmond?
Well, thank you very much, Sanjay. Thank you for the questions. I wish you all the best in your ongoing studies at Sheridan. And I mean when I say that I hope that we can continue a relationship to continue having these kinds of conversations. Being able to know what's going on campuses with journalism students in particular is like one of my great privileges of doing this work. So let us be in touch and let us continue to connect around the issues.
Thank you so much again.
You see happening.
I'm going to take off. Bye, guys.
Thank you.